There is a mountain in central Iran called Kolan Gaz-Ku. It sits roughly 90 kilometers south of the city of Qom and buried 80 meters beneath its granite surface, in tunnels carved out of solid rock and reinforced with concrete walls, thick enough to absorb a direct hit from most conventional munitions, sits the Fordow fuel enrichment plant, the most protected, most strategically significant, and, until approximately 14 hours ago, the most untouchable nuclear facility on the planet. Israel just hit it, and the consequences of what happened beneath that mountain in the early hours of this morning will redefine the trajectory of this conflict, reshape the nuclear non-proliferation architecture that has governed international security for 6 decades, and force every government on Earth to recalculate the meaning of a red line that the world spent 20 years pretending could not be crossed. To understand the full weight of what Israel did, you need to understand what Fordow actually is and why it occupied such a singular place in the strategic calculus of every government that has spent the last 2 decades trying to constrain Iran's nuclear ambitions. Fordow is not merely a uranium enrichment facility, it is the physical embodiment of Iran's strategic doctrine of survivability. After the Natanz facility was sabotaged repeatedly by the Stuxnet worm, by assassinations of nuclear scientists, by direct covert action, Iran made a decision that would define its nuclear program for the next generation. It would move its most advanced enrichment capacity underground. Not just underground in the way that a basement is underground in the way that a Cold War nuclear command bunker is underground. The tunnels at Fordow were engineered specifically to survive American GBU-57 bunker buster bombs, the massive ordnance penetrators that represent the largest conventional munition in the United States arsenal. Iranian engineers built Fordow to be, in the most literal military sense of the word, unstrikable. That calculation was not irrational. It was based on solid engineering physics and 2 decades of watching how American and Israeli military planners approached the problem of hardened underground targets. The mountain was the guarantee, and last night, Israel found a way through the mountain. The method Israel used is only now beginning to be understood by the intelligence community, and what is emerging from the early technical assessments is simultaneously extraordinary and alarming in its implications. The Israeli Air Force did not use a single weapon system. It used a sequenced strike package, a precisely choreographed combination of air-delivered munitions that exploited a vulnerability in Fordow's design that Iranian engineers had not fully accounted for. The initial wave used GBU-28 deep-penetrating bombs to open the upper tunnel structure. The second wave, arriving within a calculated interval timed to exploit the structural weakness created by the first impact, used a weapon that Israeli military censors have not yet allowed to be publicly identified, but that Western intelligence officials are describing in background briefings as a next-generation bunker penetrator with a yield and penetration depth that exceeds anything previously used in combat. The third and final element of the strike package was not an air-delivered weapon at all. It was a coordinated cyber and electronic warfare attack that disabled Fordow's internal blast door sequencing system in the seconds before impact, preventing this facility from achieving the full protective lockdown that its designers had specified as the last line of defense. This was not a strike. It was a surgical operation planned over months, executed over minutes, and designed to be definitive. Now here is what makes this moment genuinely unprecedented in the history of nuclear confrontation. Fordow, at the time of the strike, was not merely enriching uranium to the low levels used for civilian power generation. According to intelligence assessments that have been circulating among the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council for the past 8 months, Fordow was enriching uranium to approximately 84% purity, a level that has no civilian application and sits at the threshold of weapons-grade material. Iran had publicly acknowledged enrichment to 60%, which was itself a profound violation of every agreement Tehran had ever signed. The additional enrichment to 84%, conducted in the deepest and most protected section of the facility, had been concealed from International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors through a combination of access restrictions, falsified documentation, and deliberate manipulation of the monitoring equipment that the IAEA had installed under the terms of the Nuclear Safeguards Agreement. What this means, stated plainly, is that Israel did not strike a civilian nuclear facility. Israel struck what its intelligence services had concluded was an active nuclear weapons program operating within months, not years, of producing sufficient weapons-grade material for Iran's first device. The strategic logic of the strike, viewed through that lens, is not aggression. It is preemption. But the distinction between preemption and aggression is one that international law has never resolved cleanly, and the political consequences will be argued across every multilateral forum on Earth for years. The immediate military situation is this. Iran's supreme leader convened an emergency session of the Supreme National Security Council within 2 hours of the strike. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps has moved its mobile ballistic missile launchers, the Shahab-3, the Ghadr-110, the Imad, and critically the Khaybar-Shekan, which has already demonstrated its operational capability against Israeli targets, to dispersed positions across multiple provinces in preparation for a retaliatory strike. Iran's air defense network, already significantly degraded by previous Israeli operations, is operating at elevated readiness on whatever systems remain functional. The IRGC Aerospace Force has placed its drone squadrons, the Shahed series, the Mohajer, the Arash-2, on launch-ready status at multiple air bases across western Iran. An Iranian state television, which in this government functions as a direct extension of supreme leadership communications, has broadcast a statement that intelligence analysts are currently parsing with the most careful possible attention to every word. The statement says that Iran's response will be, and here is the precise phrase used, proportionate to the magnitude of the crime committed. In Iranian strategic communication doctrine, that phrase has a specific and deeply alarming technical meaning. It does not mean a calibrated, limited response designed to signal resolve without triggering further escalation. It means a response matched in strategic significance to the target that was struck. Fordow was Iran's most strategically significant military asset. A response proportionate to Fordow is not a drone swarm over Tel Aviv. It is something considerably larger. Here is what Israel's military planners knew they were accepting when they made the decision to strike. The Iron Dome system, which has become the symbol of Israeli air defense in Western public consciousness, is extraordinarily effective against short-range rockets and certain classes of drones. It is not designed to intercept ballistic missiles in the terminal phase. That role belongs to the Arrow 2 and Arrow 3 systems, which are designed specifically for high-altitude and exo-atmospheric ballistic missile interception. Israel's Arrow batteries performed well during Iran's April 2024 mass drone and missile attack, intercepting the overwhelming majority of the ballistic missiles fired in that exchange. But the Khaybar Shekan that Iran has deployed since then represents a meaningful generational improvement over the missiles used in that attack. It uses solid fuel, which eliminates the preparation time that liquid-fueled missiles require and makes them significantly harder to target before launch. It carries advanced maneuvering capability in the terminal phase that specifically degrades the effectiveness of the engagement algorithms that Arrow 3 relies upon. And Iran has produced enough of them. Estimates from Western defense intelligence range from several hundred to over 1,000 operational units, that a simultaneous salvo large enough to saturate Israel's interceptor inventory is within Iran's demonstrated capability. The Iron Dome and Arrow systems together carry a finite number of interceptor missiles. Iran has done the arithmetic. The dimension of this crisis that is receiving the least analytical attention and deserves the most is the nuclear proliferation cascade that the Fordow strike has already set in motion, regardless of what happens next militarily. Here is the logic that is now playing out in the capital of every country that has ever contemplated developing a nuclear weapons capability. Iran spent 20 years and billions of dollars building what it calculated was an unstrikable nuclear facility. Israel struck it anyway. The conclusion that every aspiring nuclear state draws from this event is immediate and unavoidable. The only deterrent that actually works is a completed nuclear weapon, because a nuclear weapons program, however hardened and concealed, remains vulnerable to military action. A deployed nuclear weapon is not. This is the precise logic that drove North Korea's decision to prioritize weapons completion over everything else: international legitimacy, economic development, diplomatic normalization, and to accept extraordinary economic sacrifice in pursuit of a capability that would make it permanently immune to the kind of preemptive strike that Israel just executed against Iran. The Fordow strike will accelerate nuclear weapons programs in countries that Western governments have spent decades trying to restrain. It will not accelerate them because those countries are irrational or aggressive. It will accelerate them because the strategic lesson written in the rubble beneath Kolangaz Ku Mountain is perfectly clear and perfectly rational. The American position is one of profound strategic complexity and profound domestic political constraint. Washington spent years warning Israel that a unilateral strike on Iranian nuclear facilities risked triggering a regional war that American forces would be drawn into regardless of authorization. Those warnings were not hypothetical. The USS Harry S. Truman is in the eastern Mediterranean. The USS Abraham Lincoln is in the Gulf of Oman. Tens of thousands of American personnel at bases across Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, and Jordan are now within range of Iranian ballistic missiles, all at elevated threat status, all potential targets. If Tehran concludes that American complicity justifies striking American assets alongside Israeli ones, the American military is at war-adjacent alert because of a decision made in Jerusalem that Washington cannot publicly condemn without destroying the most important strategic relationship it has in the region. The United Nations Security Council convened an emergency session within 3 hours of the strike. Russia introduced a resolution condemning the attack on a sovereign nation's nuclear infrastructure. China co-sponsored it. The United States vetoed it, as it has vetoed every resolution critical of Israeli military action for 70 years. But this veto lands differently. because for the first time, the target was a facility under international safeguards monitoring. The IAEA's Director General, speaking from Vienna, stated that the strike represents a fundamental challenge to the international safeguard system, and that the agency is seeking immediate access to assess damage and any potential radiological consequences. That final phrase, radiological consequences, is driving urgent private consultations across every nuclear safety body in the world. Here is the specific scenario that Iran's military strategists, in their most operational planning sessions, have prepared for this moment. It is called the Walls of Fire Doctrine. Developed within the IRGC Aerospace Force over the last 5 years and described in general terms in Iranian military publications that Western analysts have reviewed, it envisions a coordinated mass launch scenario in which Iran fires the maximum volume of ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and long-range drones simultaneously from dispersed positions across multiple provinces, specifically designed to saturate and overwhelm any missile defense architecture through sheer volume. The theory is not that every missile will penetrate. The theory is that if you fire enough, and the IRGC's production capacity and stockpile levels suggest they have enough, some percentage will inevitably penetrate even a sophisticated layered defense. And in a country the geographic size of Israel, with population density concentrated in the Tel Aviv metropolitan area and the northern corridor, even a small number of warhead impacts from K-bar-Shekin missiles produces consequences that are strategically decisive. Israel's entire strategic doctrine since 1948 has been built around one foundational principle. The country is too small and its civilian and military infrastructure too concentrated to absorb sustained punishment. The Walls of Fire doctrine is designed to exploit exactly that vulnerability. What happens in the next 48 hours will determine whether this becomes the most significant military escalation in the Middle East since 1973, or whether back-channel communications, running through Qatari, Omani, and Swiss intermediaries, who have served as the functional diplomatic backbone of every previous Iran-related negotiation, can produce enough de-escalatory signal to prevent Iran's retaliatory strike from triggering the full sequence of Israeli counter-retaliation, American force protection responses, and regional proxy activation that leads to a general war. The margins are genuinely thin. Every party to this crisis is operating under domestic political pressure that limits its flexibility. Iran's supreme leader cannot absorb a strike on Fordow without a response that demonstrates to the Iranian population and to the IRGC officer corps, which is the real power base that sustains the regime, that the revolution's strategic assets can and will be defended. Israel's government cannot show restraint in the face of Iranian retaliation without triggering a domestic political crisis that ends the current coalition. And America cannot disengage from the consequences of a crisis it did not start, but cannot avoid being drawn into. Because the moment Iranian missiles land on American bases in the region, and that moment may be hours away, the United States is at war whether it chooses to be or not. The mountain has been struck, and the mountain is answering.